Great. So it's indeed a great pleasure to be here. I'm very fond of the British Biophysical Society, although I think it started about 1962 or 63, so 54 years, because when I was a student, I was volunteered to give my very first talk at the British Biophysical Society about 1968 in London about substrate binding to chymotrypsin. So a big fan. So I think we should try and be supportive to the British Biophysical Society. And indeed, about a year ago, Samar, and so I should also say thank you to Samar and Svetlana for organizing this meeting and inviting me. But about a year ago, Samar said, the International Union of Crystallography, which is another society that I'm very fond of, decided that cryo-EM, its home belongs with X-ray crystallography because it's a similar structural method, diffraction, and so on. So it doesn't have any crystals, but it can have. And there are people doing crystals. So I think I'd encourage the audience to join up to Biophysical Society, British Biophysical Society. You can do the American one as well, if you wish. And then the International Union of Crystallography. Yeah, so I'd just like to talk to you today about cryo-EM, which indeed has had a kind of mini revolution over the last 2 or 3 years. For a number of reasons, and I'll sort of list them a bit. But basically, lots of people, particularly the electron microscope companies, have put a lot of money into developing the methodology to make it easy. And that's opened it up to people who don't really have a big background in it. And although you can do it at different depths, you can also do cryo-EM as a beginner without really very much training, actually. So, okay, so before jumping into further improvements, I thought it would be good to give a little bit of a background, because this is obviously British Biophysics. There's a lot of techniques involved in biophysics. So I thought I'd start just by showing 3 slides that we put in this, an article that Sriram, Werner Kulbrandt, and I wrote about 9 months ago for the International Union of Crystallography journal that Samar is the editor of. And we picked out 9 structures that we thought were representative. And the one thing I might need is a laser point. Oh, here it is, yeah. Yeah, got it. So we picked out 9 structures, and there's 3 on this slide. So this is probably the first high-resolution 300 kilodalton tetrameric membrane protein that forms channels that are triggered by capsaicin, a drug that's present in hot chilies and so on, and causes pain, but it's normally, this is a heat sensor. And Yifan Cheng's group, Liao et al., published this in 2013, and because most people hadn't anticipated that cryo-EM was going to be very powerful, this came as quite a shock to people, because suddenly you had structures that you could see helices, you could see side chains. There's a little bit of beta sheet here resolved. These are 4.8 angstroms apart. The resolution of the map was about 3.5 angstroms, and that had basically triggered an influx of people who had been mainly in X-ray crystallography, who had been trying to do work and not getting crystals or getting them to diffract only to 10 angstrom resolution and so on. And in fact, Liao with Yifan Cheng and David Julius at San Francisco had been working on this since it was cloned in 1997 by David Julius, trying to make crystals. And they had crystals, but they'd given up. They couldn't get them better at 10 angstroms. And eventually they thought that perhaps cryo-EM had reached the stage where they could try. And they worked for several years. But when the new detectors came in, they were able to get this map 3.5 angstrom resolution, follow all the polypeptide, fit in the residues with various ligands as well. So this made a big impact about 2.5 years ago as well. And then this second structure, gamma secretase, again, many people, including we'd collaborated with people trying to make crystals, trying to do EM and so on. But Xiaochen Bai, who was a postdoc from Tsinghua University in Beijing, came to Cambridge to work with Shor Sherez and collaborated with Yigong Shi, who's also in Tsinghua, who'd been trying to work on gamma secretase using EM. And they managed to get first a 4.5 angstrom, then a 3.5 angstrom map of this something like 170 kilodalton protein with 4 subunits, with 19 and eventually at the high resolution 20 transmembrane helices with quite good enough resolution to assign a sequence and so on. And so again, that made a big impact. And then the last one is, and I'll say a little bit more about this later, when Sriram was a younger person, and I was a younger person, from about 1997 to 2000, we had 3 years, and we were supposed to be working on single particle EM, starting it off. But in fact, we spent most of our time working on intermediates and mutants of bacteria rhodopsin. And Sriram's wife, Jacqueline, was the one who sort of kick-started this. And I'll show you a picture of it later on. One of the objects we picked out as a test specimen was this enzyme beta-galactosidase that is LAC-Z, the original operon 1961-62 from Jacob and Monod. It's a big enzyme, and it had been solved by X-ray crystallography in 1994. It's a tetramer. It was about the right size then for trying to get a start on it. And actually, it took a long time, so that was like almost 18 years ago. But now, there is this map at 2.2 angstroms that came from NIH, from Sriram's group, showing also quite nicely. So these were 3 relatively small structures in this molecular weight range. And then the next slide shows 3 more structures that are probably a bit bigger, a bit more complicated, and not necessarily all of them at high resolution. This is one of the ATPase families, these rotary motors that are either driven or drive ion fluxes through the membrane and synthesize or hydrolyze ATP in the head. And the head and the tail are connected by these stators, and the bit in the middle rotates, conveying the energy from the ion fluxes to the membrane. This is from the work of John Rubinstein, who has worked on this for about 15 years. This is one example of V-type ATPase. It's only at 7 angstroms resolution, but from the single set of images in the electron microscope, you are able to separate out now using a number of programs that do 3D classification of the images of the single particles if a structure has more than one state. And in this case, they were able to distinguish 3 states in which the central rotor is in the 3 positions rotated by 120 degrees relative to the alpha 3, beta 3 in the head of this. And there's also F types, B types, and some yeast molecules, all at about 7 angstroms, but with the structures that have been determined earlier, either by NMR or X-ray, they can be docked into it and get a pretty good idea of the structure now. And John Rubinstein also has a structure now of the V0. V1 is the head, V0 is in the membrane, of the V0 domain on its own at something like 4 angstrom. So they actually have a pretty good atomic model for every component of these ATPases. The middle one is mitochondrial complex 1. It's about 900 kilodaltons in molecular weight. John Walker in Cambridge started to work on this about 1980, sequencing the genes and so on. Judy Hurst took over that work probably about 20 years ago, has been purifying it, trying to crystallize it. They got crystals, didn't diffract very high resolution. But about 2 years ago, 2013, Judy came over and asked, would we like to have a look at this by cryo-EM? And Vinoth Kumar, who is at LMB in Cambridge, worked with Judy's postdoc, Jai Penju, who's now back in China. And this map at about 5 angstrom resolution was published about a year ago. And they have a new one now at 4 angstrom resolution in Press in Nature, in which all 45 of the polypeptide subunits have been identified, and most of them have been interpreted in terms of the amino acid sequence. A few of them have just polyalanine stretches. The colored subunits are homologs from bacterial complex 1 NAB reductase that were done by Leo Sassanov, also in that same, a different MRC unit from where I am. And then the dark red ones are the supernumerary ones that are specific to the mitochondrial. So that's another one. So both of these have completely resisted efforts, as indeed had 2 of the earlier structures. So that, and it was out of these 6 so far, 4 of them, people have been trying terribly hard and hitting their head against a brick wall by all the other methods. And then this is Hong Cho's group at UCLA. a heptameric pore-forming structure from anthrax, which is at 3 or 4 angstrom resolution. And then the last one was to go to bigger structures. These are either whole or parts of viruses. This is rotavirus that Nico's group has worked on, Nico Grigoriev, for about 10 years now. And as the methods have improved, they've got higher and higher resolutions. This is a 2.6 angstrom resolution map. That's one of the subunits, of which there are T equals 13 symmetry. So 780 of these subunits are in one virus particle. So when you get 10,000 of them, you've actually got several million copies. And as a result, you get a really nice high-resolution map of the repeating structure in it. That is Brome mosaic virus, which again, Hua Chu's group at Baylor have worked on for a number of years. This is taken with a Gatan K2 detector. This is with a direct electron, and then this one is with the Falcon. There are 3 different new detectors that have kind of revolutionized the quality of the data that you get. And then the final one is tobacco mosaic virus, which originally was negatively stained at 20 angstroms. Then about 1989, Hua Chu managed to get a 9 angstrom map where you could resolve the helices as rods. This is now 3.4 angstrom from Carsten Sachse's work at EMBL in Heidelberg, where they've pushed it, the same virus, whole viruses processed with helical diffraction. That gives you an idea of the sorts of things that people have been doing recently. And then I wanted just to take a step back and show you how we got here. And largely the method that we use, which is to make a thin film of the liquid with enzymes, viruses, small particles, helices, and so on. Jacques Dubochet spent several years with his group at EMBL also, figuring out the behavior of water, thin films of water. If you cool it slowly, you get hexagonal ice, just like in snowflakes. If you cool it rapidly, you get amorphous ice, and if you warm it, you get cubic. So he analyzed the phase diagrams and how to do it, and these were his 2 pieces of apparatus for doing this plunge freezing. And the idea is you have the forceps with a little 3mm grid. You put a little drop of the 2 or 3 microliters of your solution, blot it, and then plunge freeze it into a little bath of liquid ethane here, cooled by liquid nitrogen around it. And this one's you just release this little catch and it falls under gravity. It goes at about a meter per second, rapidly cools the thin film, and then you can take images of it. This is Jacques a few years ago. They also had this earlier apparatus involving 2 elastic bands that fired the grid down into the liquid ethane. And these are very simple, you see, and very reliable, whereas now most people are using these FEI Vitrobot automatic computer-controlled things, which do seem to go wrong a lot more often. And then so we actually have 3 of them at LMB, and now we used to have 1 plunge freezer. People used it about once every 2 or 3 months. These now have little booking sheets. So, you know, there's lots of people who have no background are actually getting perfectly good results with cryo-EM. Okay, then just wanted to take a step back. So what are the main things? So one thing I wanted to emphasize is that the companies, particularly FEI recently, have put an enormous effort into making the electron microscopes better. They've made the vacuum better so you don't get ice on your specimen when it's cold. They've made the cold stages better so they don't drift around because of 0.01 degree temperature fluctuations. They've introduced 1,000 times brighter electron guns that give you coherence so you can defocus the images and so on. So that has been a major thing, and I'll just show you in a moment a comparison between 1985 and 2010 and so on, which is entirely due to the microscope technology. Obviously, I mentioned already the plunge freezing, and then the detectors are the things that made a big difference in the recent years. We used to use film. Others, because of the convenience of electronic detectors, use these phosphorus CCDs. They were not as good as film, actually, at high voltage, but these new detectors are better than all of them. And then underlying it all, there's been a whole sequence over 30 years of software development from Spider and the Magic through the most recent ones that are more explicitly taking care of all the parameters that you need to go to high resolution, EMAN, Freeline, XMIP, and Relion. And then I thought I'd do one example. This is a picture from 1984 from Jacques Dubochet's group at EMBL. After developing these methods and studying the behavior of water, EMBL decided that this is very boring, and they decided that he should leave. But then he took this picture of adenovirus, which was the life's work of the new director at EMBL, and then he was reinstated at that point. But you can see this adenovirus is a very big virus, and you can see the subunits here. And they did, about 1986, some image processing using very special programs and got it to 45 angstroms. But a bit later on, Phoebe Stewart, who was a postdoc at EMBL in Steve Fuller's group, did it again slightly better and got this as a 35 angstrom map made from a few dozen of these particles from single images. So that was how it stood from 1991 to 2010. And the only thing that changed during those 20 years are the technology. So the film was the same, the computer programs were similar, but Hong Chu took this image. This is the same virus, same magnification, but now instead of seeing these little blobs for the subunits, you can see internal structure inside them. And this is a 100 kilovolt microscope with a tungsten filament on film. This is a 300 kilovolt field emission gun, 1,000 times brighter, also on film, same film. And so but when they processed these images, they got this map here from these images. And when you look at sections of the map, it's at about, instead of 35 angstroms, it's 3.6 angstrom resolution. They could follow all the polypeptide, see many of the side chains, and interpret the map in a lot of detail. And that is 10 times the resolution, which is in all 3 dimensions. So that's 1,000 times as much data. And they're doing it with technical improvements only in the microscopy. They did take something like 1,500 images on pieces of film, which they had to develop and scan and so on. So it was a lot of, so they also did a lot of work alongside the technical improvements. But that's before the new detectors and before some of the new computer programs have come in as well. And then I thought I'd just show you a little bit about how it was that we switched from being X-ray and electron crystallographers to being convinced that single particle electron cryomicroscopy was the future. So this was a review that I didn't really particularly want to write, but I was involved in a discussion in Grenoble when they were thinking of building beamlines at ESRF, and the X-ray microscopy people said, X-rays are just fantastic, far better than electrons. And of course, those of us who'd known about it knew that that wasn't true. So this review says that electrons are 1,000 times less damaging than X-rays per useful elastic event that contributes to the images. So we said, okay, electrons are the best, X-rays are terrible, and even neutrons are worse than X-rays. It turns out they do more damage because of nuclear reactions. Not big. But then, having done that, I thought, well, we should do a calculation. If electrons are better, how many images do you need? And you don't, unfortunately, you don't need one image. So this was you don't need to look at this, and I've shown this many times. Some of you will have seen this before. But the idea was to calculate for different sizes of structures, from a virus like adenovirus right down to a tiny little protein like cytochrome C or lysozyme, to calculate the scattering and the signal in the image before you destroy the sample by radiation damage, and then to figure out, first, can you see the particles? And this column here says how many sigma to see whether there's anything there in terms of above the noise level just from an image taken with a certain amount of dose. And the idea was above about 6 or 7 kilodaltons, you can see it. Above about 40 kilodaltons, you can orient it. This is, you can find the orientation, 5 parameters rather than 2. And then finally, how many particle images do you need to get a high resolution, say 3 angstrom map? And we said at that point that it was about 10,000. We now think that the criterion we used there was too conservative, and you probably only need about 1,000. And so we're still a long way from being able to do that. And the question is, and that's the sort of focus of this talk, what do we need to do to get from where we are now, which is quite productive and quite popular, but to make it really as powerful as it can be? And there's probably another factor of 50 or something like that to be gained in terms of the particle number. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Here are 6 examples of how these images look now. Obviously, in 20 years ago, they weren't so good, but this is a structure that actually Sriram and I and Peter Rosenthal worked on, and Jacqueline, in about the year 2000. And this is a grid that was made in the year 2000. It's been sitting in the liquid nitrogen for 16 years. And so we fished it out and took a new picture on one of the new detectors. So this is a 1.5 megadalton enzyme, pyruvate dehydrogenase. You can see 2-fold views, roughly 5-fold views, and sort of nearly 3-fold views. And you can get a structure for this because it's quite a big structure. But if you then go smaller, this is the mitochondrial complex 1 that I mentioned Vinoth Kumar and Judy Hurst have worked on, and now have a structure in press with all of the atoms, and just from images just like this. And then you come down to 0.5 megadalton. This is beta-galactosidase. This is the structure that Sriram took the first images for in 1997, and I'll show you one of those in a minute. This is on the new detectors, and you can see each of the enzymes. You can see the 4 subunits here, another 4 slightly different views, all of them. And then after a while, you recognize the views. So this one is also okay. A step down further, this is catalase, which is also a 200 kilodalton tetramer. And here, the blotting of the liquid film has squeezed the molecules out of the middle. And this is a ring where they're all more or less in the same orientation with a little bit of aggregation at the air-water interface. And then you go out further, you see all the different views. And at the very edge, where the ice is thicker before you come to the carbon support, you can see some of them are overlapped. But again, by eye, you can see the orientations and judge them quite well. And then if you go down now to 100 kilodaltons, this is a protein called C-reactive protein that Mark Pepys in London has worked on. They call it also a pentraxin because it's got 5 identical subunits. And if you look, you can see, you can count the 5 subunits in the top views, and these would be the side views because it's a little disc-shaped object. So again, 100 kilodaltons. And then if you go down smaller, this is hemoglobin that is the structure. We thought Max would really be pleased if we were able to do this by cryo-EM. And there are people now working with faceplates, Rado Danef and Martinsried, who've collected some data on this, and they have a sort of low-resolution map of that at the moment. So basically, and then if you go down smaller, they become just little dots, and you can see them still, but you can't find their orientation so well. So what's been the main step forward? It's been these detectors. So this is a measurement of detective quantum efficiency as a function of resolution from low resolution out to the limiting resolution where 2 pixels would have a Fourier component going up and down at the edge of the image. They call this the Nyquist resolution. And a perfect detector would have 100% all the way across here. And this was what we were doing for many years on film at 300 kV, about 30%. And these are the 3 detectors as they were about 2 years ago when we measured this. This is the FEI Falcon, Gatan's K2, which does counting and gives it an advantage at low resolution. And then that's a direct electron. But all of them have been improved a bit subsequently. And I think pretty soon we're hoping to have one that will be pretty good and maybe 100% dropping to 60%. So with these detectors then, I'll just show you 2 or 3 examples. That's the same image I showed you of mitochondrial complex 1. That was the published map at about 5 angstrom resolution, contoured at 2 levels. A high level where you see these 8 iron-sulfur complexes, which are the only features if you contour at a high level. Drop the contour level and you can see the 76 transmembrane helices, some of which they interpreted in this map from a couple of years ago. And if you drop the contour level further, you see this band of detergent and lipid that surrounds because it's been solubilized to make it into single particles. And then that was the map that I showed you earlier. And as I say, there's a new one, which I haven't looked at in detail, but should be coming out shortly, in which they've managed to identify all of the 45 subunits. Okay, the next one is beta-galactosidase. And maybe that's the same image I showed you before with the subunits. This was our various efforts. Actually, there's earlier ones here, and we didn't really believe any of these until 2011. And this was a map calculated with EMAN from images taken on film at 80 kV. But the big change came here when we switched, and we couldn't get any better than that, 11 angstroms. So suddenly, with the new detectors, we got first to 6 angstroms, and then we stopped at 3.8 angstroms with images on our Falcon detector with a 1.8 angstrom pixel size, which is almost 3.6 would be Nyquist. But Sriram and his group went on and did with higher mag and more particles and more work, and got a really nice map with the side chains, such as the one I showed you earlier, with even some little possible holes in the middle of the. Okay, so then another example. I'm just going to show 2 or 3 of these. This is mitochondrial ribosomes, which Alexei Amunts, working in Venki Ramakrishnan's group in Cambridge, had been working on for about 2 years, trying to purify it. And it turns out that mitochondria have ribosomes, but not very many of them. So however hard you try, you can never completely purify them away from cytoplasmic ribosomes. And one of the powers of the cryo-EM images, once you get images like this, some of these ribosomes are mitochondrial ones, which was the target of his work. Others are cytoplasmic ones that have been carried over in the purification. So what can be done, and this was done in a collaboration with Georges Cherez's group, and Cherez wrote this new program, RelyOn, that had built into it 2D and 3D classification from the beginning with quite sophisticated algorithms for balancing the signal and the noise. And they were able to separate it into half a dozen classes, some of which were mitochondrial, either the whole ribosome or just the large subunit, some of which were cytoplasmic and some of which they didn't know. But by combining them and then refining the orientations of the particles only on the big subunit or the small subunit, they were able to get a good map of the large subunit or the small subunit, and then eventually build a model of the whole structure. And this is 3 of the pieces of density, a little bit of double helix, RNA Watson-Crick double helix, showing you good resolution between the bases at a nominal 3.1 angstroms, which gives you an intuitive feeling that the resolution is correct because these are well resolved. And then looking down on one of these Watson-Crick base pairs, they would be there with the 3 hydrogen bonds. That would be an example of an alpha helix, a little piece of beta structure with a loop with side chains, and then another one that they believe was a magnesium ion. And then another, so Venki Ramakrishnan's group, his work was entirely based on X-ray crystallography for a while, although he did have a little try about 2003 with cryo-EM then, but only got a 15 angstrom map or something like that. But these are now, and there are now lots and lots of ribosome structures from many, many groups at 3 angstroms or 2.9 or 2. Very good structures. So another one is from the group of Kiyoshi Nagai at LMB in Cambridge, and this is Kelly Nguyen. And Kiyoshi had always been a little bit hesitant about EM, actually, focused on X-ray crystallography, but Kelly, who was a fearless student, decided that she was going to start without actually, asking. And after about 6 months, she did actually charm various people to help her. But nevertheless, it's all entirely her work. She'd been doing the biochemistry, she did the microscopy, and then after about 6 months, it started to work. So first one and then another of the other people in Kyoshi. So now most of the group is doing cryo-EM. And then this is their yeast tri-SNRP map with parts of it that are at really good resolution, so maybe 3.7. So this would be an alpha helical part, hints of some side chains, and then another little bit of double helical and single-stranded RNA in the map. And then I think probably the last one is this gamma secretase, which was on the very first slide, Xiaochen Bai's work, collaboration with Yigong Shi and then Georges Cherez's group in Cambridge. And you look at this image, it doesn't look much actually, it looks a bit messy, but they pick all the particles and they do this 2D classification and then go into 3D and then refine it, and then they get a 3.4 angstrom map. And that's the one that I showed you. This is a lower resolution one, 5 angstroms initially, and that's where they had 19 transmembrane helices and some beta structures, so perhaps 4.5 angstroms. But the most recent map, which was a lot more work, I think they took about 500,000 single particles. That was the map I showed earlier. That's the extra helix they found when they got to high resolution. And these are all the transmembrane helices, and also some parts where there's a carbohydrate attached to the polypeptide, which they were also able to interpret, and 2 lipid molecules that carried through with the preparation, even with head groups on it. So I think this is a map that is fully up to the standards that we've come to expect in X-ray crystallography. And I thought I'd just put one little plug in for Shor's Sherez program that he wrote starting in 2010 with his new group in Cambridge, which was a group of 1 himself. And he spent 2 years writing this Relion, and he was always very clear, because he'd worked in Spain on XMIP, which is another system, that it was very important to make it accessible to people who didn't have a lot of training or background. And this is his graphical user interface, where you just, in the beginning, you put in the pixel size and the size of your particle, and you carry on down here. This is picking particles. This is a micrograph of beta-galactosidase, the particles that have been picked. And you can see this is the name of the micrograph. There are 300 particles and so on. I think there's 100 micrographs, so 35,000 particles or so on, and then you get a 3.8 angstrom structure, so on. But Shor's has made it accessible to beginners, as well as you can go behind it and do scripting and so on for people who are a little bit more advanced. And so that's a key thing. So then this is the key thing in terms of how are we going to make the cryo-EM give us perfect maps that are limited only by radiation damage. And there's still a lot of things that need to be done. The detectors are quite good, but it could be, a lot better. You could have 100% DQE right out to the edge. There are people working on phase plates. So normally, if you take an in-focus image, just like in optics, there's no contrast. You have to defocus to get bright field phase contrast. And then that spreads the image out, and it's more complicated to compute. So in optics, you have these Zernike phase plates that give you a 90-degree phase shift of the illuminating beam relative to the scattered beams. And also in optics, they dim it a bit by having it at slightly optical density of, say, 1. In EM, you just need to either make the direct beam have a 90-degree phase shift or the scattered beams. And lots of people have had lots of different ideas for how to make a faceplate, but a lot of them get charged up. But recently, Radostin Danev, was in Japan for many years working on these faceplates, is now in Max Planck Institute in Martinsried with Wolfgang Baumeister. They have one that works now, and FEI have commercialized it. And even if you don't buy one, if you buy a new microscope, you will get a free faceplate with it. And many people are rather enthusiastic about it, although it needs further development. We have not got a chromatic aberration corrector anywhere in the world for biological structure cryo-EM yet. We need one. They cost a lot of money because these CC correctors are very complicated and very expensive. But that would allow you, instead of the scattered energy loss electrons, some of the electrons that go through the specimen lose energy, and then they're not focused properly. But by having a CC corrector, those would be, instead of contributing to the noise or having to be removed by an energy filter, could be contributing back to the image in phase and contributing the signal rather than the noise or rather than having to be removed. Radiation damage, I'll say a bit more about it. At the moment, we're all working at liquid nitrogen temperature, and even then, when you put the beam on, the specimen moves around. But the possibility exists that at liquid helium temperature, you get a further factor of 2 or 3 or 4 in terms of how long you can take an exposure before your structure shows the signs of radiation damage. And if you can overcome this beam-induced movement problem, there's another big gain to be made there. And that's this beam-induced motion I already mentioned. And obviously, this we all try to make the ice as thin as possible. So these are the factors. If we fix all of those, we will have a fantastic method that will be a lot better than it is at the moment. This is our own efforts. This is film again. This is the DQE of detectors. This one, the red one, is the existing FEI detector. This is a slightly improved one they've made by more back thinning and better electronics. And these are both integrating detectors, as is film. This is the Gatan K2, which is a counting detector. It converts the electrons into individual counts that are then all equal, and then you get a better DQE. But if you do counting on the Falcon, and this is our efforts to use a real detector to do it, that's what it gives, but it should be eventually even better. So detectors is one of the improvements. Here's another type of analysis of images. All these new detectors work by having a continuous readout, like a movie camera. So they have a rolling shutter. It reads the image, and it reads it again, and reads it again, and then you just add them up. And the noise is sufficiently low that you get a really nice picture. But you can then go back later and ask which frame of the movie. I did a 3-second exposure. I've divided it up into 30 1/10 of a second frames. Which of the frames contain the most information? And actually, if we get it to work, the first frame, which has no radiation damage, should be best, and all the other frames should gradually die away until it's completely dead. So this is a plot of frame number, but converted into electron dose. And by here, you've done a lot of radiation damage. Here, there's no damage. And instead of plotting, this one plots the signal by a correlation method at a particular resolution. And these ones plot B factors of models calculated from single frames from all the particles, comparing it to the structure that you get. And what you see in all of them, the first few frames, people just throw them away. They should be the best, but they've got some kind of charging or beam-induced movement. It ruins the image, and then it sort of settles down, and then eventually you get radiation damage and so on. And these B factor curves or information curves, they should be straight lines. This should go up like this and should be straight. So we're losing an enormous amount, actually. If that can be fixed, that will make a very big difference. Okay, so I'm just coming to the end now. So these are the three things. Better detectors, getting rid of beam-induced movement. One thing I didn't mention is that we've collaborated with a number of people who are working on very fragile structures that behave very well by gel filtration. You get a really nice peak. You think this is just easy, we'll freeze them. You freeze them, and then you don't see what you know was there. They've been somehow or other destroyed, possibly by interacting with the air-water interface, because we've made these thin films of liquid that are only a few hundred angstroms thick, although they started as a drop that was 1 millimeter in diameter. So the surface-to-volume ratio has gone up by 100,000 or so, and then these protein molecules get denatured on this air-water. Not all of them. The ones I showed you pictures of before are the well-behaved ones. But this needs to be fixed. And then I also mentioned quarter wave plates, of which there is now one practical plate that people are using, and the possibility of CC correctors. Okay, so then I've given you a kind of overview of where we are, what we're hoping, but we're hoping it'll be a really, really powerful method, and you'll be able to do smaller structures with fewer images, or you can choose higher resolution or more multiple states. So basically, you can do anything you want now. So I'll just finish with, yeah. So these are Xiaoxia Chen took a lot of these images and has been involved in some of the projects, but she actually manages all our electron microscopes, and we thought we'd never need more than 5, but at LMB now we're up to 9. Although some of them are old ones, so that you can prepare your specimens. Greg and Wazi do our detector development, and Linos being the one who's done all of the biologically interesting things. I also showed Dubochet and Hongchu's adenovirus, Yifan Cheng's group TRIP1, and some work on Sriram, he may say about it, mitochondrial ribosome splices, so on and so on. So thank you very much. Yeah.